we talked about how it's important for a computer to have memory, and how memory is important to our own heads, and how if we didn't have memory, it'd be really difficult for us to do probably any type of processing or computational problem solving. We need memory to operate, and likewise computers need memory to operate. So there are many places inside a computer where computers remember things. And so I wanted to kind of draw you a diagram of some of these different places inside a computer where computers remember different things, right? And so all you have to know is that these different areas are places where computers are remembering stuff, right? And even though they have different names and different functions and different capacities, all it really comes down to is this is yet another place where a computer is remembering something. And it's remembering, you know, basically on and off. It's remembering zeros and ones. That's what it's remembering. So as it stores stuff places, it's storing those zeros and ones in places. And there's various places where it could store that stuff or remember it. So let's take a look at it. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just draw out just conceptual diagram of this being the CPU. And inside the CPU, we have different things like we have the arithmetic logic unit, and we have the control unit, and then also inside the CPU we have something called registers. Alright, so here inside the CPU we have the arithmetic logic unit and the control unit. Those are just two components inside the CPU. And then we also have registers, and registers is one of the places where computers remember things. Also inside the CPU you will have something called cache, right? And so inside the CPU there will be cache, and sometimes you'll hear that cache referred to as L1 cache. So I'm going to draw a little L1 cache, and sometimes there will even be L2 cache or L3 cache. And as that cache goes up in numbers, right, like L2 or L3 cache might be just outside the CPU, or it could be inside the CPU. So that's cache. So both registers and cache, right, are places where computers can remember things. And these are really like working areas right here. These are working areas where the computer is like remembering stuff, remembering zeros and ones as it works with them. And then the next thing we have is RAM. And so we saw that little thing. We saw RAM in the last video. And RAM stands for Random Access Memory. So there's our RAM. And RAM is also known as primary storage. So it's also known as primary storage. That's just another way that it's known. So RAM is another place where computers remember zeros and ones. So here we've got RAM, Random Access Memory. And then over here we have what is known as secondary storage. Secondary storage. And secondary storage will consist of your optical drives. There'll be optical storage, there'll be magnetic storage, and there'll be solid state storage. So those are three types of secondary storage that are out here: optical, magnetic, and solid state. And optical storage includes like CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray, those types of storage. Magnetic storage, you know, consists of like hard disk drives. We used to use floppy drives. You also will have tape sometimes, tape backup storage for magnetic storage. So that's storing zeros and ones with magnetic positive and negative charges. And solid state storage is the technology that's used for flash technology. And that will be things like solid state drives or flash drives, flash thumb drives, things like that. And then one last area where we remember stuff is an area called ROM. And ROM stands for Read Only Memory. Read Only Memory. And on ROM, so let's highlight that. That's also a place where we remember stuff. On ROM is something called BIOS. And BIOS stands for Basic Input-Output System. Basic Input-Output System. So ROM is another area where we have things stored. It stands for read-only memory. And what's stored on ROM is your BIOS, Basic Input-Output system. Two characteristics I want to point out to you here. A couple things I want to point out if you look at this entire picture. Pull it back just a touch. There we go. A couple things I want to point out is one, a characteristic of primary storage in RAM is that it is volatile, meaning if the power goes out, whatever was stored in RAM is lost, right? And this is non-volatile over here for secondary storage, meaning if the power goes out, whatever's stored over on secondary storage is not lost, right? And then another characteristic which is good to know about of everything that is up here is that as we move away from the CPU, so as we move away from the CPU or towards the CPU, basically way out here on this line, right, way out here, we have more storage, slower access. So we could store a whole bunch of stuff out here in secondary storage, but it takes us longer to go out and get it, right? Versus over here at this end of that green line, so let me just do the green line right here too. Over here we have less storage space, and faster access. So that would be the other side. Less storage space, but faster access. So as we go from over this area here, we're not going to be able to store a whole lot of zeros and ones right there, but the CPU is going to be able to access this stuff really quick. We could store more zeros and ones right here in RAM, and the CPU will still be able to get to those zeros and ones pretty quick. We could store even more, a whole ton, everything that we need to store, we could store out here in secondary storage, right? But for the CPU to access it, it takes a long time to go all the way to the CPU and come all the way back. So pull back just a touch. So that going all the way out here and back takes a long time. And so we could have less storage space here, faster access, more storage space here, slower access in between these different areas. So these are all areas where computers remember stuff. Last thing I want to say is, why do computers need ROM? Why do they need BIOS? So ROM stores BIOS, and BIOS is basic input-output system. BIOS has also been called, and ROM has also been called firmware, because it was kind of this combination of software and hardware. It was software, zeros and ones, that were permanently burned into the hardware. And what was that software that was burned into the hardware? So it was just basically zeros and ones or switches that were set in certain on and off positions. That software is the basic software to get the computer up and running. And so when a computer would first start, it looks to BIOS, which is on ROM, to see to get its basic input and output software, And so that basic software stored on ROM, the BIOS, that tells the computer how to start connecting all of its devices together, so that the CPU can start loading programs from the hard drives into RAM, and that the CPU can communicate with RAM, and that it could all start working. And so that basic input and output system software is how the computer starts up, and it loads BIOS first, and that allows it to start communicating with the hard drives, at which point it could start loading the operating system off of the hard drive. So that's the importance of memory inside computers. There's these different areas inside computers that computers use to store zeros and ones, and we have cache, we have registers, we have RAM, which is also known as primary storage. RAM is also known as primary storage. The characteristic of RAM is that it's volatile, meaning if the power goes out, whatever is stored in RAM is gone. And then we have secondary storage, which could be broken down into your optical storage, like your CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, or your magnetic storage, like tape backup or hard disk drives, or your solid-state storage, like solid-state drives. And a characteristic of secondary storage is that it's non-volatile, meaning if the power goes out, whatever is stored there remains there. We don't lose those zeros and ones. And then the last area inside a computer that remembers stuff is ROM. And the importance of ROM is that it stores BIOS. And BIOS is the basic software that starts the computer running when the computer first starts up. That's the basic software that gets loaded. And that is a little bit of information about how computers remember stuff.